What's going on, everyone? Welcome to another episode of the Blade of Truth podcast based on Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 12. I'm your host, Reagan Amos, and we're going to dive into today's episode, Who or What is Your Delilah? Now, you may be wondering why I am holding a flintlock pistol. Now, this isn't a real pistol. This is a replica that I like to have in my office, but I really like this single-shot flintlock pistol. I like muskets as well. I love that whole era of combat and everything. But the reason I really like this single-shot flintlock pistol is because it reminds me of how I like to study the Bible. Now, when I shoot this flintlock pistol, I am aiming for a certain target to hit. I'm not expecting this bullet to go all over the place. Now, the way I mean this in my Bible study is when I go to a certain chapter or a book, I am intently focused on the context. If I'm at a certain chapter, I'm looking for repetition. What is the author repeating? Maybe a word or a phrase he's repeating over and over to get my attention, to tell me, hey, this is important, but also application. What can I grab from this text that can be applied in my life that I can use throughout daily living? Now, some people like to study the Bible like a shotgun blast. They shoot and it goes everywhere, and they're going to different passages of Scripture, and I think there's a time for that. It's great to cross-reference. But many times in my study, like I said, I like the single-shot bullet. And that's what we're going to do this episode. Now, you may be wondering about the title. Who or what is your Delilah? Well, if you go to Judges chapter 13, we're first introduced to a man named Samson. He's also a judge. Now, when the Israelites fled or left Egyptian bondage, they were in the wilderness for 40 years, and then they finally crossed the Jordan, and they go into their conquest of Israel, or at the time, Canaan. And what happens is eventually they settle down and they get in their certain tribes, and then there are people called judges. They're not like the judge you and I would think of in a court of law, but I guess you could say more so as a chieftain, if you will. They many times were military leaders. They made big time decisions, and Samson was one of these judges. But I want you to pick up your Bible and go to Judges chapter 13 with me. We're first introduced to this man named Samson. Now, early on in the chapter 13, we read that he's going to be a Nazirite. He's not going to cut his hair. He's not going to drink the fruit of the vine. He's not going to touch dead bodies. He's going to live a different lifestyle. And notice, many of us know that he has this great strength. And we're going to see that as we go on. Now, he may have been strong physically, but he may not have been as strong spiritually. But we're going to read and learn from Samson. One thing I always wondered is, why is Samson in the Faith Hall of Fame? Now, as we read on, we're going to be thankful that Samson's in the Faith Hall of Fame in Hebrews chapter 11, because if Samson is in there, there's hope for you and I. But let's look at Judges chapter 14. Judges chapter 14, and notice in this chapter, if you read, which I hope you can do on your own time, but for time's sake, we're not going to read the entire chapter. Samson finds a woman. Now, that's not a bad thing, but she's a Philistine. And the thing with the Philistines is they were not the people of God, and at this time, the Israelites, or the Hebrews, if you will, were not to intermarry because God wanted them to be set apart. He didn't want to take on certain practices of the pagans. And for instance, there was a pagan god named Molech of the Canaanites, and he wanted baby sacrifice. In fact, it was so bad, there was a historian named Plutarch who said that when these evil priests of Molech would take the children of these families and they were putting them to this fire. Many times when you read the Old Testament, it says they passed through the fire or the flame of Molech. It means they were giving child sacrifice to this fake god, false god, Molech. Plutarch writes that when the flame started, the children would start to scream, and the so-called priests of Molech would beat drums and they would scream so the parents couldn't hear the screams of their own children. And that's what God did not want the Hebrews to engage in. Unfortunately, as you read the history, they did do that. But he finds this Philistine woman, but eventually he gets to the wedding celebration, and the Philistines come in and they do a bunch of riddles. And Samson gives them a riddle, But eventually, the Philistines go to his soon-to-be wife and ask her, what's the answer to the riddle? And she gives it to him. And so what Samson has to do is he has to go get tunics because they betted on certain tunics. And so Samson goes out to get those tunics. Well, he comes back. And the reason I'm giving this context is we're probably going to understand a little better as to why Samson did what he did. Watch this. Look at when he comes back. Verse 19 of Judges chapter 14. It says, "Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily, and he went down to Ashkelon and killed 30 of their men, took their apparel, and gave the changes of clothing to those who had explained the riddle." See, that's what we talked about earlier. So his anger was aroused, and he went back up to his father's house. And Samson's wife was given to his companion, who had been his best man. Notice in the context of what's happening to Samson, he tries to marry this Philistine woman, which he should not have done. He gets into a wager, a bet, which he should not have done. And then the Philistines get into that relationship. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But eventually, he loses the wager, the bet. He goes and gets the apparel, brings it back, and then he comes back, guys, to his supposed-to-be wife, now with his best man to his wedding. That's not it. Watch this. Look at Judges chapter 15 and verse 1. "After a while, in the time of the wheat harvest, it happened that Samson visited his wife with a young goat. And he said, 'Let me go into my wife, into her room.' But her father would not permit him to go in." Why? Her father said, "I really thought that you thoroughly hated her." Well, why would he think that? Well, if you remember, on their wedding day, Samson left. I don't know if the father of this woman knew about the wager Samson had with these Philistines, but he thought, since you left, you didn't want to be with my daughter. And notice what he says, verse 2, "Therefore I gave her to your companion." I don't know if any of you have gone through this, but could you imagine for a moment that you have to leave the wedding for hopefully it's not for betting or making a wager, but you leave because something happens, you have to go take care of it, and you come back, guys, and your best man is married to who you're supposed to be married to. I don't know about you, I wouldn't be happy. But notice what happens. Verse 3, "And Samson said to them, 'This time I shall be blameless regarding the Philistines if I harm them.' Then Samson went and caught 300 foxes, and he took torches, turned the foxes tail to tail, and put a torch between each pair of tails. When he had set the torches on fire, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines, and burned up both the shocks and the standing grain, as well as the vineyards and the olive groves." Now, if you're thinking that's weird, can I tell you something? From a history standpoint, this is not weird. In fact, this happened a lot. In fact, if you know Genghis Khan, many know him as Genghis Khan, what he would do many times is when he was on his conquest with the Mongolian Empire, if he saw a city that was very well fortified, he would actually get certain birds, light them on fire, and they would go into the city and burn the roofs and make the city in disarray. Not only that, his grandson, Kublai Khan, did the same thing, but with horses. He'd set the horses on fire, and he would let them run toward the enemy camp, and it would burn through the tents, and it would hit men, and then his armies would charge. And this is what Samson's doing. He's burning these animals on fire and releasing them into the wheat and the grain and the vineyards of the Philistines, hurting their economy. And notice what happens. Remember, not only was his supposed-to-be wife now with his best man, watch what happens to her. Verse 6, "Then the Philistines said, 'Who has done this?' And they answered, 'Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he has taken his wife and given her to his companion.' The Philistines came up and burned her and her father with fire." Guys, this is before we even get to chapter 16 with Delilah. You're going to notice in Judges chapter 16 what he's about to do, which is not smart, but can you kind of understand where his head is right now? Number one, he lost his supposed-to-be wife to his companion, and now, still having feelings for her, still, I'm sure, claiming to love her, watches her and her father burn right in front of him. And of course, this is what happens right before Samson goes on and kills 1,000 Philistines with the power of God through the jawbone of a donkey. But notice Judges chapter 16, and this is where we're really going to focus for this episode. Who or what is your Delilah? Now, before we dive into this, We talked about application earlier. What I love to do with this is look at Delilah as a temptation. When I ask who or what is your Delilah, I want you to think of a certain temptation, whether it's a person, a thing, an action, whatever it may be, who or what is your Delilah? And not only do I want you to do that, think of Delilah as your temptation, and then I want you to look at the Philistines as the sin or the result of giving into that temptation. You're going to see what I mean as we go on. Are you ready? All right, let's go. Look at Judges chapter 16 and verse 1. This is really neat here. Now that we know a little bit of the context, we might better understand, not saying Samson should have done this, but we can understand that I may not wish or want Samson to do this, but just look at verse 1. Now Samson went to Gaza and saw a harlot there and went into her. Should he have done that? No. But notice what happened to this man. Look at verse 2. When the Gazites were told Samson has come here, they surrounded the place and lay in wait for him all night at the gate of the city. They were all quiet at night, saying, in the morning, when it's daylight, we will kill him. And Samson lay low till midnight. Then he arose at midnight, took hold of the doors of the gate of the city, and the two gateposts, pulled them up, bar and all, put them on his shoulders, and carried them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. Could you imagine that sight? Could you imagine a man? Of course, the power of God flowing through this man's muscles, his veins, being able to do this. But notice verse 4. This is where we get into the story many of us know, but maybe we haven't applied it in this sense. Follow with me. Look at verse 4 of Judges 16. Afterward it happened that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek. Throughout the Bible, a valley often meant a low place because a valley was the low place between two mountains or two hills. Many times in this geography, in this time, they would fight battles in the valley. They'd be camped up on two sides. If you remember David and Goliath, they were in the valley of Elah. And one army was on this hill or mountain and the other was on this hill or mountain. And they would face in the valley. But many times we can apply the valley as low places in our life. Maybe battles that we're facing. We may have been on the mountain or the hill in one area of our life, and then something happens and we find ourselves in the valley. But notice on the other side of the valley is what? The mountain. Don't be focused so much on the valley. Be focused on the mountain. Be focused on things above. Colossians chapter 3. But look at verse 5. Notice we're introduced to Delilah, aka our temptation. But look at verse 5. And the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, entice him and find out where his great strength lies and by what means we may overpower him, that we may bind him to afflict him. Every one of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver. You remember, as we spoke earlier, look at Delilah as the temptation and the Philistines as the sin or the result of giving into that temptation. Notice Delilah the temptation, and notice the Philistines are saying, if he gives into you, what will we do? We will bind him and afflict him. What do our temptations do to us? Notice it says in verse 5, it entice him. Our temptations try to entice us. And when we get enticed, we give in, and like the Philistines, and like the result of our sin, we will be bound and afflicted. Look at verse 6. Delilah said to Samson, please tell me where your great strength lies, and with what you may be bound to afflict you. And Samson said to her, if they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings, not yet dried, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. Notice temptation comes knocking, verse 6. And he gives an answer in verse 7, but notice verse 8. The lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh bowstrings, not yet dried, and she bound him with them. Verse 9, now when lying in wait, staying with her in the room, and she said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson, but he broke the bowstrings as a strand of yarn breaks when it touches fire. So the secret of his strength was not known. Do you think the temptation's going to stop there? Do you think when we perhaps overcome a certain temptation that it's just going to stop? That Satan's just going to stop after, oh, well, I got beat and that's it? I don't know about you, but that doesn't happen to me. Temptation comes knocking. And notice this Delilah, aka temptation, is going to come knocking again. Look at verse 10. Then Delilah said to Samson, look, you have mocked me, told me lies. Now please tell me what you may be bound with. Question, how many times are we going to let temptation just lie around? How many times are we going to allow the temptation, whatever it may be in our life, just to hang around us, tempting us day after day? But look at verse 11. So he said to her, if they bind me securely with new ropes that have never been used, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. Therefore Delilah took new ropes and bound him with them and said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And men were lying in wait, staying in the room, but he broke them off his arms like a thread. Verse 13, Delilah said to Samson, until now you have mocked me and told me lies. Tell me what you may be bound with. He said to her, if you weave the 7 locks of my head into the web of the loom, she wove it tightly with the batten of the loom and said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he awoke from his sleep and pulled out the batten and the web from the loom. Then she said to him, how can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You have mocked me these 3 times and have not told me where your great strength lies. Now listen, maybe you've done this because in my life I've done it too. I'm like, Samson, you dummy. You would think after maybe the first, but especially the second time, hey, maybe there's a correlation between me telling this woman where my great strength lies, and all of a sudden, when I tell her these things end up happening. And we look at Samson and we say, he's so foolish. But can I ask you how many times we've done the same thing in our life? Maybe we say, well, I'm not going to do this again. And we pray to God, I'm not going to do this particular sin. I'm not going to say this. I'm never going to do that again. And how many times have we done it again? You see, there are many times we ourselves have fallen into the same foolishness of Samson. Before we get on to Samson for seeming so silly, we need to look at our life and say, man, Samson, I feel you. I'm right there with you. I've done the same thing in my life. But notice verse 16. This is great relationship advice. Look at verse 16. And it came to pass, when she pestered him daily with her words and pressed him so that his soul was vexed to death. Notice this temptation, Delilah, is pestering him how much? Daily. But look at verse 17. That he told her all his heart and said to her, no razor has ever come upon my head, for I have been a Nazarite to God from my mother's womb. If I am shaven, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man. I said that this would help us in maybe marital problems, relationship issues. This is something we can learn from. I don't know if you're in a relationship, or maybe you've been in a relationship. Maybe you are in a relationship right now, and the other person wants to know more about you. They want to get more deep within this relationship, to get deep into this relationship you now have. But maybe you don't want to tell the other person really personal stuff. Maybe you feel as if you don't want to tell them what you're struggling with spiritually, or what you had struggled with, or certain problems you had in the past. But why? Could it be that maybe it's us, maybe it's the person in our relationship is a Delilah-like person? This is what I mean. Notice, Samson finally opens up in this relationship. Maybe you've opened up in a certain relationship and that man or woman used it against you. And maybe you're currently in that relationship now where the other person, or perhaps you opened up and you told them something deep. Maybe you opened up and told them something dark and they used it against you. And now you're hesitant, or perhaps you never open up again. Why? Notice what Delilah did to Samson. Watch this. When Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, I know as a man, and guys, you can probably agree with me, we don't often open up. Why? Because, well, we're making ourselves vulnerable. Our society says if you do that, you're weak, which that's not what I read in the Bible. David did it all the time. But perhaps we're hesitant because that other person is going to use it against us. Maybe you're a woman and this has happened to you or is happening to you. But we've got to make sure as Christians, we cannot be the Delilah type person. If our spouse is going to give us the trust and trust us enough to tell us what's going on in their life, to tell us what they are struggling with, Guys, I can't tell you the amount of love this person has for you, the amount of strength they're trying to muster to overcome whatever it is in their life, to tell their spouse or perhaps someone in a relationship. We have got to make sure we don't betray that trust and we don't use it against them. When they tell us those things, what they're saying is, I love you and trust you enough to tell you these things. But look at what Delilah did. Verse 18. When Delilah saw that he told her all his heart, she sent and called for the lords of the Philistines, saying, come up once more, for he has told me all his heart. The lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought the money in their hand. Then she lulled him to sleep. Many times temptation likes to not wait when we're alert, not to come when we're alert, not to attack when we're alert, but when we're lulled. Maybe we're in a low place. Notice where Samson is, low place. Maybe we're not as spiritually, as Paul would say to Timothy, fan the flame. Maybe our flame isn't burning bright. Waits till we're lulled. Lulled to sleep on her knees, and called for a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. Then she began to torment him. Guys, watch this. Verse 17, look at it. That he told her all his heart. This man was willing to be vulnerable. He was willing to give all to this woman. And notice, it's not till 2 verses later, verse 19 says, she began to torment him. In our relationships, when someone tells us all their heart, do we torment them? When we make a mistake in our marriage, maybe in the church, maybe in a friendship or a relationship, are we going to torment them? Or are we going to be thankful they trust us enough to tell us that they love us enough that they told us and they're willing to work on said whatever it is and help them through that, or are we going to torment them? And it may be that in our marriage, in our relationships, maybe in the church, we're not willing to come forward. Maybe we're not willing to talk about the things that are behind closed doors, whatever it may be, because we're going to be tormented for it. But the question we got to ask ourselves, are we the Delilah type person in tormenting our spouse or other people around us? Talk about application. Boy, these chapters are rich with it. But look at verse 20. And she said, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. He awoke from his sleep and said, I will go out as before at other times. He said, well, I've overcome this temptation so much. I'm good. I'll get over it. But he let that temptation lay around or hang around too often, and it caught up to him. How many of us have a temptation we're just hanging around? We'll say, I can overcome it. I can stop at any time. What Samson said. He said, just like at other times, and shake myself free, but keep reading. But he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. Why? He let it hang around too long. Verse 21. Then the Philistines took him and put out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza. They bound him with bronze fetters, and he became a grinder in the prison. Remember earlier I said, look at Delilah as the temptation. Now look at the Philistines as a result of giving into that temptation. Did Samson give into the temptation? Yes, he did. And now notice the result of giving in. Notice the sin. See, notice what the Philistines did to him. Look at verse 21. The Philistines took him, put out his eyes, and brought him down to Gaza. They bound him with bronze fetters. When we give in to sin, when we give in to temptation, sin puts out our eyes. It stops us from seeing what life's all about. It takes out our eyes to stop us from seeing what matters most in life and seeing the way, the truth, and the life, John 14, verse 6. And notice, it binds us. It makes us a prisoner. Verse 22 says, however, the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaven. But let's keep reading in verse 23. Does this apply to us? Absolutely. Verse 23 says this, now the lords of the Philistines gathered together to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon their god and to rejoice. And they said, our God has delivered us, or delivered into our hands Samson, our enemy. When the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, our God has delivered into our hands our enemy, the destroyer of our land, the one who multiplied our dead. Verse 25. What happened when their hearts were merry? They said, call for Samson, that he may perform for us. Philistines sin. When we are prisoners of sin, we can't help but perform for our sin. When we are a slave to our sin, we perform for it. And you know what? It makes us do things we don't want to do. Sin will take us further than we're willing to go and cost us more than we're willing to pay. They called for Samson from the prison, and he performed for them. So many times we say, well, as I'm not a Christian, so I can live it up. No, you're performing for your own lust. You're a prisoner of your own lust and sin. That's what Samson had to do. And they stationed him between the pillars. Now, the cool thing about this whole episode is not only are we going to see the mistakes of Samson, we're going to see how Samson actually ends up in Hebrews 11, in the Faith Hall of Fame. How in the world does he do that? Did we just read the mistakes he made? And then when we look at our life, we're like, man, the more we read this, the more we say, man, I kind of relate more to Samson than really I knew I did. But that's not where the story ends. Maybe you're like Samson and you've given in to the same temptation over and over, even when you've prayed time and time again, God, I'm not going to give in to this temptation anymore, and you find yourself doing it. And you see, Satan actually isn't that concerned with us making mistakes or falling from time to time. He's not really concerned with that, because if we get up and keep moving forward, he doesn't have us. He wants us to drown ourselves in despair. And he wants us to stop us from continuing on till the end. But God says, stay faithful when? Until the end. But keep reading. We're going to see how Samson actually ends up in the Faith Hall of Fame. Watch how neat this is, and I pray we can apply this in our life. Maybe you have a temptation that is pestering you daily. Maybe you've fallen in the same sin, and you're doing all that you know to overcome this sin or temptation. Watch what Samson did. I know that's actually kind of crazy. How in the world can we learn from Samson to overcome sin? I'm telling you, it's here. Let's go. Follow me. Verse 26. Then Samson said to the lad who held him by the hand, let me feel the pillars which support the temple, so that I can lean on them. Now the temple was full of men and women. All the lords of the Philistines were there, about 3,000 men and women on the roof watching while Samson performed. Notice the Philistines represent sin. Remember that. Verse 28. Then Samson called to the Lord, saying, O Lord, remember me, I pray. Strengthen me, I pray, just this once, O God, that I may with one blow take vengeance on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. Notice number one, if we want to overcome the sin problem in our life, notice what Samson did. He prayed to God earnestly to take vengeance on what the Philistines had done to him. You and I need to have the mentality. We want to take vengeance on the sin in our life. We want to take vengeance on the very thing that blinded us from what mattered in life. We want to take vengeance on the very thing that binded or bound us and made us fulfill or perform for it or them. But look at verse 29. And Samson took hold of the 2 middle pillars which supported the temple, and he braced himself against them, one on his right and the other on his left. How do we apply this? Notice who was standing on top of the temple. It was the Philistines. Well, the Philistines represent what? Based on what we said earlier, sin. Notice what Samson had to do. It says he took one pillar on his right and one on his left. What supported the temple? With the people on it. What's supporting our sin? Maybe we have a sin behind closed doors. What is supporting us engaging in that sin? Maybe we have something that's going on in our mind. Maybe it's a certain place we go to. Whatever is supporting that sin or that temptation, take the pillars and take them out. Don't give an opportunity for sin. But notice it says he had to brace himself against it. Guys, when we are overcoming a temptation or a sin in our life, we better brace, because it's not going to be easy. And not only that, it's going to hurt. Look at verse 30. Then Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. Notice the humility now that Samson now has. He says, I'm not even worthy to die among the righteous or among the people of God because of what I've done. He says, you know what? I understand. I don't deserve a burial. I don't deserve this. I don't deserve that. Let me just go out with these people. For a Jew to say that, that is literally the highest form of humility. Because he looks at his life and he says, God, when you judge me, look at my life, I'll understand it. In Psalms, we read that David had that attitude. He said, you'll be just when you judge me. Look at verse 30. Then Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. And he pushed with all his might to overcome the sin, to get rid of the sin. We've got to have the mindset to take vengeance. We've got to take out the pillars that support that sin. And we've got to push. with all our might. That reminds me of Matthew 5. When Jesus is talking about if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. Of course, that's hyperbole. What Jesus is saying, you do and take whatever measures necessary to overcome that sin. Notice that's what Samson does. Really neat the correlation here. He pushed with all his might, and the temple fell on the lords and all the people who were in it. The dead that he killed at his death were more than he had killed in his life. And his brothers and all his father's household came down and took him and brought him up, and guess what? Buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of his father, Manoah. He had judged Israel 20 years. I deserve to die with these Philistines that mock you, that partake in the child sacrifice and the deities that forced them and wanted them to take in sinful acts. But guess where he ended up being buried? Why? He didn't give up. He didn't quit. He took vengeance on the sin, if you will. He took the pillars, took them out, and he pushed with all his might. And notice what's so neat, because he trusted in himself and his own physical strength. But notice when that strength was taken away for a time, it humbled him to the point where he now realized and saw that his strength actually came from the Lord. Even though Samson's eyes were taken out, that he was blinded, he could see more clearly than he ever could. And there's so much that we can gain from the story of Samson and so much others. And I'm so excited to dive into more studies with you. Now, that concludes our episode for today. I always want to end with this. Listen, if you're in the Oxford area or around Oxford, Alabama, what I would love for you to do is join us at our congregation here. It's on 89 Hamrick Drive East, Oxford, Alabama, 36203. Our service times, we've got a Bible study Wednesday night at 6 p.m. Sunday mornings, we have Bible study at 9:30 a.m. and worship service at 10:30 a.m. Listen, if you're looking for a congregation of God's people that just want to be Christians, that just want to follow Jesus, not man-made doctrines, not added stuff, we just want to be followers of Jesus Christ. If you want a congregation like that studies the Word of God intently and want to use the sword of the Spirit, the Word of God, and go into not just the world, our community, come and join and visit us. We'd love to have you. Looking forward to another episode with you. Hope y'all have a great week. Thank you so much for tuning in.